In 1857, the small town of Millbrook in Loudoun County, Virginia, was a place where time seemed to move as slowly as the Potomac River that wound through the valley below. The rolling hills were dotted with modest farmsteads, and the main road that connected the settlement to the larger world was little more than a dirt path that turned to mud with every rainfall. It was here, in a weathered, clapboard house that sat on the edge of town like a forgotten afterthought, that Margaret Thornfield lived alone with her only remaining possession of value, a woman named Sarah who had served the household for nearly 30 years. The Thornfield property had once been prosperous, spanning 200 acres of fertile tobacco land, but the death of Margaret's husband, Samuel, in 1854, had left the widow struggling to maintain even the basic repairs needed to keep the elements out of her home. The fields had been sold off piece by piece to pay mounting debts until only the house and a small kitchen garden remained. Neighbors often remarked that Margaret could easily resolve her financial difficulties by selling Sarah, whose skill as a seamstress and cook made her valuable in the local market. Yet every offer was met with a firm refusal that bordered on the violent. Dr. William Harrison, who had served as the town's physician for over 2 decades, later recalled that Margaret's reaction to such suggestions was always the same. Her face would flush crimson, her hands would tremble, and she would demand that the subject never be raised again. When pressed by well-meaning neighbors about her stubborn attachment to keeping Sarah when she could barely afford to feed herself, Margaret would retreat into a silence so complete that visitors felt compelled to leave rather than endure the oppressive atmosphere that descended upon the household. The peculiarity of the arrangement extended beyond Margaret's refusal to consider any sale. Sarah herself seemed bound to the property by something stronger than legal ownership. Local merchants noted that she never ventured into town alone, despite being permitted by Margaret to handle all household business. When she did appear in public, always with Margaret at her side, her demeanor was that of someone perpetually listening for sounds that others could not hear. Her eyes would dart toward shadows, and she would position herself so that she could always see the path back to the Thornfield house. The relationship between the two women confounded those who observed it. Margaret treated Sarah not with the casual authority typical of ownership, but with a deference that suggested something closer to fear. During church services at Millbrook Presbyterian, the few occasions when both women appeared in public together, congregation members noticed that Margaret would defer to Sarah's judgment on matters as simple as which pew to occupy or when to rise for hymns. The Reverend Thomas Whitmore documented in his private journal that he found their dynamic so unsettling that he began to dread their attendance. In the autumn of 1856, a series of incidents began that would later be remembered as the first signs that something deeply wrong existed within the Thornfield household. Mrs. Elizabeth Porter, whose property adjoined the Thornfield land on the eastern border, reported to her husband that she had been awakened 3 nights in succession by what sounded like digging. The sounds came from the direction of the Thornfield property, always between the hours of midnight and dawn, and always seemed to originate from somewhere behind the main house, where a small outbuilding had once stored farm equipment. When confronted about the nocturnal activity, Margaret claimed complete ignorance. She suggested that perhaps wild animals were responsible, or that the autumn winds were playing tricks on Mrs. Porter's imagination. But the sounds continued with such regularity that other neighbors began to take notice. James Fletcher, whose farm lay to the north, mentioned to several people at the general store that his dogs had taken to howling every night, at approximately the same time that Mrs. Porter heard the digging sounds. The animals would fix their attention on the Thornfield property and remain agitated until sunrise. The mystery deepened when young Timothy Walsh, the blacksmith's apprentice, reported seeing lights moving about the Thornfield property well after Margaret and Sarah should have retired for the evening. The lights appeared to be carried by someone moving between the house and the old equipment shed, following a path that seemed deliberately designed to avoid the main windows of neighboring properties. When Timothy mentioned this to his master, Robert Walsh, the older man cautioned him against spreading gossip about the widow and her troubles, but the apprentice's account was corroborated by others who had begun paying closer attention to the Thornfield property during the late evening hours. As winter approached, the strange nocturnal activities ceased as abruptly as they had begun. The neighbors who had been disturbed by the mysterious sounds and lights found themselves relieved by the return of quiet nights, yet somehow unsettled by the sudden change. It was as if the very air around the Thornfield property had been holding its breath, and now released it in a long, slow exhale that carried with it the promise of revelations yet to come. Margaret's behavior during this period became increasingly erratic. She began making trips to the county courthouse in Leesburg with unusual frequency, always accompanied by Sarah, always carrying a leather portfolio that she clutched protectively against her chest. Court clerk Benjamin Matthews later testified that the visits were ostensibly related to property records and estate matters. But Margaret's questions seemed oddly focused on the legal requirements for transferring ownership of assets under unusual circumstances. She inquired repeatedly about the difference between a sale and a bequest, and whether there were legal mechanisms that could prevent the future sale of property regardless of financial necessity. During one particularly memorable visit in late November of 1856, Margaret requested to examine records dating back to the original land grants that had established the various properties in Millbrook. She seemed particularly interested in any documentation related to the history of the plot where her house now stood, asking specifically about previous owners and any unusual circumstances surrounding property transfers. When Matthews explained that many of the older records had been damaged in a courthouse fire 15 years earlier, Margaret's reaction was so intense that Sarah had to escort her outside to recover her composure. The winter of 1856 into 1857 was remarkably harsh, with snowfalls that isolated Millbrook for weeks at a time. During these periods of enforced solitude, neighbors noticed that smoke rose from the Thornfield chimney at all hours, suggesting that someone in the household was keeping unusually irregular schedules. Mrs. Porter, whose view of the Thornfield property was clearest during the winter months when the trees were bare, reported that she often saw figures moving past the windows well into the early morning hours. The movement seemed purposeful rather than restless, as if important work was being conducted under the cover of darkness and winter isolation. When spring arrived and social interactions resumed their normal patterns, the changes in both Margaret and Sarah were immediately apparent to anyone who had known them before. Margaret had lost considerable weight and developed a nervous habit of constantly touching a small locket that hung from a chain around her neck. The locket was unfamiliar to those who had known her for years, and its appearance seemed to coincide with her increasingly agitated state. Sarah, meanwhile, had acquired a wariness that made her seem older than her estimated 40 years. She moved through her daily routines with the careful precision of someone navigating through a world full of potential dangers. The first direct glimpse into the true nature of the situation came in March of 1857, when a traveling merchant named George Morrison stopped at the Thornfield house seeking to purchase eggs and preserved goods for his journey north. Morrison later told anyone who would listen that his brief interaction with the household had left him deeply shaken. He had been invited into the kitchen to conduct his business, as was customary, but had become increasingly uncomfortable with the atmosphere inside the house. According to Morrison, the kitchen showed signs of being frequently rearranged, with furniture moved away from certain areas of the floor and walls marked with what appeared to be chalk symbols. More disturbing were the conversations he overheard between Margaret and Sarah as they gathered the goods he had requested. Their exchange was conducted in hushed tones, but Morrison distinctly heard references to keeping something hidden and maintaining certain routines that seemed designed to prevent discovery rather than facilitate household efficiency. Most unsettling was Morrison's observation that both women seemed to be listening constantly for sounds that he could not detect. Their conversations would stop abruptly, and both would remain frozen in place for long moments before resuming their activities. When Morrison asked if they were expecting another visitor, Margaret's response was sharp enough to make him regret the inquiry. She informed him that they never received unexpected visitors and that anyone approaching the property would be heard long before they arrived at the house. The merchant completed his business as quickly as possible and departed with the distinct impression that he had witnessed something he was not meant to see. His account, shared at various stops along his route, began to spread stories about the Thornfield household that went far beyond the simple eccentricity that neighbors had previously attributed to Margaret's behavior. Morrison's description of the household as a place where two women lived in constant fear of discovery resonated with others who had observed the pair's increasingly strange behavior. In April of 1857, an incident occurred that would later be seen as the beginning of the final unraveling of whatever secrets the Thornfield household contained. Dr. Harrison was summoned to treat Sarah for what Margaret described as a fever, but his examination revealed injuries that were inconsistent with illness. Sarah bore fresh bruises on her arms and a cut on her scalp that appeared to have been caused by a blow rather than a fall. When questioned about how she had sustained these injuries, Sarah's responses were so contradictory that Harrison became convinced she was either confused by fever or deliberately concealing the truth. Margaret's explanation was that Sarah had fallen while carrying firewood from the shed behind the house. But Harrison noticed that Sarah's injuries were on parts of her body that would not typically be harmed in such a fall, and her obvious reluctance to provide details made him suspicious that something else had occurred. When he suggested that Sarah should rest for several days to recover properly, Margaret's agitation was so extreme that she demanded he leave immediately and threatened to call upon another physician if he continued to ask inappropriate questions. The doctor's report of the incident, confided to his wife and later shared with Reverend Whitmore, marked the beginning of more systematic attention to the Thornfield property. Harrison's concerns were taken seriously because of his reputation for discretion and his experience in recognizing signs of domestic violence. His assessment that Sarah had been deliberately harmed, combined with Margaret's violent reaction to any inquiry about the circumstances, suggested that the household harbored secrets darker than simple eccentricity. Throughout the summer of 1857, a pattern emerged that confirmed the worst suspicions of those who had been observing the Thornfield property. Sarah's appearances in public became increasingly rare, and when she did venture out with Margaret, her physical condition showed signs of ongoing mistreatment. She moved with the careful gait of someone managing persistent pain, and her reluctance to make eye contact with anyone outside the household suggested either illness or intimidation. The few conversations that neighbors managed to have with Sarah during this period revealed a woman who seemed perpetually fearful of saying something wrong. Her responses to even casual inquiries about her health or the household's well-being were so carefully measured that they seemed rehearsed. Mrs. Porter noted that Sarah's manner of speaking had changed dramatically over the past year, becoming formal and distant in a way that suggested she was constantly monitoring her own words for potential problems. Meanwhile, Margaret's trips to the courthouse continued with such frequency that they became a subject of speculation throughout Millbrook. Court Clerk Matthews observed that her inquiries had evolved from general questions about property law to very specific requests for information about inheritance rights and the legal status of assets acquired under unusual circumstances. She seemed particularly concerned with understanding the difference between property that could be sold by an estate and property that was bound by legal restrictions that would survive the death of the current owner. During one visit in late July, Margaret requested copies of all available records related to the history of her property prior to her husband's acquisition of the land in 1832. When informed that such records would need to be requested from the State Archives in Richmond and would take several months to obtain, her reaction suggested that time was a critical factor in whatever plans she was developing. She offered to pay additional fees for expedited service and insisted on providing a detailed description of exactly which types of documents she needed, focusing particularly on any records that might mention previous residents or unusual circumstances surrounding property transfers. The urgency of Margaret's research became more apparent when she began making inquiries at properties throughout Loudoun County that had been established during the same period as her own. She would arrive unannounced at farmsteads and modest homes, always accompanied by Sarah, always carrying her leather portfolio, always asking questions about the history of the land and any unusual events that previous owners might have mentioned. These visits were remembered by recipients as deeply uncomfortable experiences, partly because of Margaret's obvious desperation, and partly because of Sarah's disturbing behavior during these encounters. According to multiple witnesses, Sarah would position herself near doorways during these visits, maintaining constant visual contact with the path back to their wagon while simultaneously monitoring Margaret's conversations. Her attention seemed divided between watching for potential threats and listening for specific information that might be relevant to their purpose. When homeowners attempted to include Sarah in the conversations or offer her refreshment, her responses were so minimal and nervous that most people concluded she was either unwell or under some form of constraint that prevented normal social interaction. The pattern of visits continued throughout August and into September, covering properties in an expanding radius around Millbrook. Margaret's questions became more specific and more disturbing with each encounter. She inquired about basements, root cellars, and other underground spaces. She asked whether previous owners had mentioned finding anything unusual when digging foundations or wells. Most troubling, she repeatedly asked whether anyone had reported hearing unexplained sounds coming from beneath their houses or from areas where no apparent source could be identified. These inquiries were sufficiently strange that several property owners compared notes and reached the conclusion that Margaret was searching for something specific rather than conducting casual historical research. The consensus was that she believed something had been hidden or buried somewhere in the area, and that her visits were part of a systematic effort to locate it. The involvement of Sarah in these visits suggested that whatever Margaret was seeking was connected to her refusal to consider selling the woman who had served her household for decades. By late September of 1857, Margaret's search had apparently yielded results that satisfied her immediate needs because the pattern of visits to neighboring properties ceased abruptly. However, this change coincided with a resumption of the nocturnal activities that neighbors had observed the previous autumn. Mrs. Porter again reported sounds of digging during the overnight hours, but this time the activity seemed more focused and purposeful. Rather than the random excavation that had characterized the previous year's disturbances, the new sounds suggested systematic work being conducted according to a specific plan. The autumn of 1857 brought changes to the Thornfield household that would prove to be the final phase of whatever had been building toward resolution over the previous months. Margaret's behavior shifted from frantic searching to methodical preparation, as if she had found what she needed and was now implementing a plan that had been forming for some time. Her trips to the courthouse ceased entirely, but she began making arrangements that suggested she was preparing for significant changes to her living situation. Dr. Harrison, whose previous concerns about Sarah's welfare had been dismissed, received an unexpected summons to the Thornfield property in early October. Margaret's message, delivered by a young boy from town who had been paid to make the journey, simply stated that medical attention was needed immediately. When Harrison arrived at the house, he found Sarah in a condition that suggested she had been subjected to severe physical trauma over an extended period. Her injuries were consistent with prolonged confinement in a space too small for normal movement, and her psychological state suggested someone who had endured extreme psychological pressure. More disturbing than Sarah's condition was Margaret's behavior during the examination. Rather than showing concern for Sarah's welfare or embarrassment about the obvious evidence of mistreatment, Margaret seemed primarily focused on obtaining specific information from the doctor about Sarah's likely survival prospects and the time required for complete recovery from her injuries. Her questions were clinical in their detachment, as if she were discussing the treatment of livestock rather than a human being who had served her household for 30 years. When Harrison attempted to address the circumstances that had led to Sarah's condition, Margaret's responses revealed the extent to which her mental state had deteriorated. She spoke of obligations that transcended normal human relationships, of debts that could only be paid through specific forms of suffering, and of knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women who understood the true cost of certain types of survival. Her manner of speaking suggested someone who had convinced herself that her actions were justified by circumstances that outsiders could never understand. The doctor's examination revealed evidence that Sarah's mistreatment had been systematic and prolonged, involving not only physical abuse, but also deprivation of food, water, and adequate shelter. Yet Sarah's responses to questions about her treatment were so carefully neutral that Harrison realized she had been coached to provide answers that would minimize the appearance of deliberate harm. Her manner suggested someone who had learned that survival depended on protecting her abuser rather than seeking help from potential rescuers. Harrison's report to local authorities marked the beginning of official interest in the Thornfield household, but the investigation that followed revealed complexities that no one had anticipated. When Sheriff Benjamin Curtis arrived at the property with a warrant to examine the premises and interview both women, he discovered evidence of activities that went far beyond simple domestic abuse. The house showed signs of systematic modification designed to create hidden spaces and muffle sounds that might attract outside attention. The basement, which had been mentioned in county records as a standard root cellar, had been extensively modified to include multiple chambers connected by passages that seemed designed for concealment rather than storage. The walls showed evidence of recent excavation, and the floors bore stains that suggested the space had been used for purposes that involved significant amounts of water and other liquids that had not been adequately cleaned. Most disturbing were the personal belongings that had been carefully arranged throughout the underground chambers, including clothing, jewelry, and personal effects that clearly did not belong to either Margaret or Sarah. The discovery of these items led to a broader investigation that revealed the true scope of what had been occurring at the Thornfield property. Among the personal effects found in the basement were items that matched descriptions of belongings that had disappeared, with several women who had vanished from the area over the previous 5 years. These women, all of whom had been traveling alone or had limited family connections that would ensure immediate reports of their disappearance, had been presumed to have moved on to other locations or met with accidents on poorly maintained roads. The investigation revealed that Margaret had been using Sarah as an accomplice in a systematic pattern of targeting vulnerable women who could disappear without immediate notice. The process involved inviting traveling women to stay at the Thornfield property during harsh weather, or when they needed temporary shelter while seeking employment or family members in the area. Once these women were isolated at the property, they were subjected to imprisonment and abuse that ended with their deaths and burial in the chambers beneath the house. Sarah's role in these crimes was complex and troubling. Evidence suggested that she had been both victim and accomplice, forced to participate in the mistreatment of other women under threat of her own death, but also complicit in maintaining the system that allowed Margaret's crimes to continue undetected. Her detailed knowledge of the basement chambers and her ability to assist in the disposal of evidence indicated that she had been Margaret's partner in maintaining the operation for several years. The legal proceedings that followed the discovery revealed a story that shocked even those who had suspected that something was seriously wrong at the Thornfield property. Margaret's confession, given in exchange for a promise that Sarah would not face execution, detailed a progression from financial desperation to systematic murder that had been enabled by the isolation of their property and the assumption that two women living alone posed no threat to travelers seeking temporary shelter. According to Margaret's account, the crimes had begun in 1854. Shortly after, her husband's death left her with debts that threatened to result in the loss of her property. The first victim had been a woman seeking work as a domestic servant who had responded to Margaret's advertisement in a newspaper from a neighboring county. The woman's disappearance had been easily explained as a decision to seek employment elsewhere, and the valuables she carried had been sufficient to meet Margaret's immediate financial needs. The success of this first crime had led Margaret to develop a systematic approach to targeting vulnerable women. She would place advertisements for domestic help in newspapers from distant areas, selecting women who indicated they had few local connections and were desperate enough to travel significant distances for employment. Once these women arrived at the isolated Thornfield property, they would be imprisoned in the basement chambers and subjected to abuse that gradually escalated until Margaret decided they posed too great a risk of discovery to be allowed to survive. Sarah's participation in these crimes had been secured through a combination of threats and promises that revealed Margaret's skill at psychological manipulation. Initially forced to assist in the imprisonment and abuse of victims under threat of her own death, Sarah had gradually been convinced that she was equally culpable for the crimes, and therefore equally dependent on maintaining the secrecy that protected both women from discovery. Margaret had reinforced this dependency by sharing the proceeds from the victim's possessions and promising that Sarah would inherit the property if she continued to cooperate. The basement chambers where the crimes had occurred showed evidence of careful planning designed to facilitate both the systematic abuse of victims and the concealment of evidence. The spaces had been soundproofed using techniques that Margaret had learned from her husband, who had worked as a carpenter before acquiring the farm that became the Thornfield property. Ventilation systems had been installed to ensure that victims could be kept alive for extended periods, and drainage systems had been created to facilitate the disposal of evidence after victims were killed. The disposal of bodies had been accomplished through a cremation system that Margaret and Sarah had constructed in one of the basement chambers, using techniques adapted from industrial processes that Margaret had researched during her trips to neighboring counties. The ashes and bone fragments that remained after cremation were mixed with lime and buried in areas of the property that had been carefully selected to avoid detection during casual observation or future agricultural use. The investigation revealed that at least 7 women had been murdered at the Thornfield property over a period of 3 years, with their deaths occurring at intervals that had been carefully planned to avoid attracting attention through too frequent disappearances. The victims had been selected based on their vulnerability and isolation rather than the value of their possessions. Although Margaret had consistently profited from their murders through the sale of their belongings in markets distant enough to prevent recognition. The trial of Margaret Thornfield became one of the most notorious criminal cases in Virginia during the 1850s, attracting attention from newspapers throughout the region and establishing legal precedents for cases involving female defendants accused of multiple murders. Margaret's defense team attempted to argue that her crimes had been committed under severe psychological distress caused by financial desperation and social isolation. But the systematic nature of her activities and the careful planning evident in the modifications to her property made such arguments difficult to sustain. Sarah's testimony during the trial provided the most detailed account of how the crimes had been committed and revealed the psychological techniques that Margaret had used to maintain her cooperation over several years. Her description of the systematic abuse inflicted on victims and her own role in facilitating that abuse provided evidence that supported the prosecution's argument that Margaret's crimes represented a calculated pattern of behavior rather than isolated acts committed during temporary psychological disturbance. The verdict, reached after 3 days of deliberation, found Margaret guilty of 7 counts of murder and sentenced her to death by hanging. Sarah, whose cooperation with the investigation and testimony during the trial were considered mitigating factors, received a sentence of life imprisonment. The Thornfield property was seized by the county to satisfy outstanding debts and court costs, and the house was demolished to prevent it from becoming a site of morbid curiosity for visitors attracted by the notoriety of the crimes committed there. The case established legal precedents that influenced the prosecution of similar crimes throughout the region, particularly regarding the treatment of accomplices who could demonstrate that their participation had been secured through threat of death. Sarah's sentence was later commuted to 20 years imprisonment, and she was released in 1877 after demonstrating consistent cooperation with prison authorities and expressing what was accepted as genuine remorse for her role in Margaret's crimes. The investigation into the Thornfield murders also revealed weaknesses in the systems used to track the movement of vulnerable populations, particularly women traveling alone in search of employment or family members. The ease with which Margaret had been able to target victims who would not be immediately missed highlighted the need for better communication between law enforcement agencies in different counties and more systematic attention to reports of missing persons who might otherwise be assumed to have simply moved on to other locations. The basement chambers where the crimes had been committed were filled with concrete and lime before the demolition of the house, but the site remained a source of local unease for decades afterward. Neighbors reported that the area where the house had stood seemed to resist normal agricultural use, with crops failing repeatedly and domestic animals showing reluctance to graze in fields that included the former Thornfield property. These reports were likely influenced by knowledge of the crimes that had occurred there, but they contributed to a persistent belief that some locations retain evidence of the suffering that occurred within them. The psychological aspects of Margaret's crimes attracted attention from early practitioners of what would later become the field of criminal psychology. Her ability to maintain normal social relationships while simultaneously conducting systematic murders challenged contemporary understanding of criminal behavior and contributed to developing theories about the capacity of individuals to compartmentalize different aspects of their lives in ways that allow them to function normally in most social contexts while engaging in extreme antisocial behavior in hidden environments. Sarah's survival and eventual reintegration into society provided opportunities to study the long-term psychological effects of forced participation in violent crimes. Her accounts of the techniques Margaret had used to secure her cooperation and the psychological mechanisms she had developed to cope with her situation influenced early understanding of what would later be recognized as trauma-based psychological responses to extreme stress and coercion. The records of the Thornfield case were preserved in the Virginia State Archives, where they remained available to researchers studying historical patterns of violent crime and the development of legal responses to complex criminal cases involving multiple victims and accomplices. However, access to these records became increasingly restricted over time, partly due to concerns about privacy rights of surviving family members and partly due to the disturbing nature of the evidence that had been preserved. In 1862, during the early phases of the Civil War, a fire at the courthouse in Leesburg destroyed many local records, including some documents related to the Thornfield case. The loss of these records was not considered significant at the time, since the primary evidence had already been transferred to state archives, but it meant that certain details about the investigation and trial were preserved only in newspaper accounts and personal recollections that became increasingly unreliable as time passed. The site of the former Thornfield property was eventually incorporated into a larger farm operation, and by 1870 few visible traces remained of the house where the crimes had occurred. However, local residents maintained an unofficial tradition of avoiding the area, particularly during evening hours, based on reports of unexplained sounds and a generally oppressive atmosphere that seemed to persist despite the passage of time and the lack of any physical structures that might account for such phenomena. By 1880, most of the people who had direct knowledge of the Thornfield case had either died or moved away from the area, and the crimes became part of local folklore rather than living memory. Stories about Margaret and Sarah evolved over time, becoming less precise about the actual details of what had occurred, but maintaining the essential elements that made the case a cautionary tale about the potential for evil to flourish in isolated circumstances where normal social oversight is absent. The case continued to influence law enforcement practices in rural Virginia well into the 20th century, particularly regarding the investigation of missing persons cases and the importance of maintaining communication between different jurisdictions when tracking individuals who might be targets for predatory criminals. The systematic nature of Margaret's crimes and the careful planning that had allowed them to continue undetected for several years provided a template for understanding how criminal activity could be concealed through exploitation of social assumptions about the harmlessness of certain demographic groups. Modern researchers who have studied the available records of the Thornfield case have noted its significance as an early example of serial killing by a female perpetrator, and its demonstration of the ways in which social isolation and economic desperation could combine to create conditions that enabled extreme criminal behavior. The case also provided an early example of the psychological techniques used to secure the cooperation of accomplices through a combination of threats, promises, and carefully constructed dependency relationships. The final disposition of Sarah after her release from prison in 1877 remains unclear, as records from that period indicate only that she left Virginia and was believed to have relocated to a western state where her identity and history would not be known. Her ultimate fate became a subject of speculation among those familiar with the case, with some believing she had successfully established a new life under an assumed identity, while others suspected that her psychological damage had been too severe to allow for normal social reintegration. The legacy of the Thornfield case extends beyond its immediate historical significance to encompass its role in establishing precedents for the legal treatment of crimes involving systematic abuse and murder committed in domestic settings. The careful documentation of the evidence found at the property and the detailed testimony provided during the trial created a record that influenced the prosecution of similar cases for decades afterward, particularly regarding the challenge of proving systematic criminal behavior when much of the evidence had been deliberately concealed or destroyed. The transformation of the Thornfield story from documented historical fact to local folklore illustrates the process by which extreme criminal cases become embedded in regional cultural memory, serving as both cautionary tales and sources of continuing unease that persist long after the immediate facts of the case have been forgotten or distorted. The evolution of the story over time reflects changing social attitudes toward crime, punishment, and the capacity of individuals to commit acts that challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature and social relationships. In the end, the Thornfield case serves as a reminder that the most disturbing crimes often occur in circumstances that seem least likely to harbor such extreme behavior, and that the isolation that can protect criminal activity from discovery can also enable escalation to levels of systematic abuse that would be impossible to sustain in environments where normal social oversight functions effectively. The case also demonstrates the importance of maintaining systems that can identify and respond to patterns of criminal behavior before they progress to the levels of systematic violence that characterized Margaret's crimes. The documentation that survives from the Thornfield case continues to provide insights into the psychological and social factors that can contribute to the development of serial criminal behavior and the techniques that perpetrators use to maintain the secrecy and social camouflage necessary to continue their activities over extended periods. These insights remain relevant to modern understanding of criminal behavior and the development of investigative techniques designed to identify and interrupt patterns of systematic abuse before they escalate to the levels demonstrated in the Thornfield murders. The physical evidence recovered from the Thornfield property was eventually transferred to the Virginia State Archives, where it remained catalogued but rarely accessed due to its disturbing nature. Among the items preserved were personal effects from the victims, including jewelry, clothing fragments, and handwritten letters that provided the only remaining connection to the women whose lives had ended in the basement chambers of the isolated farmhouse. Dr. Harrison, whose initial concerns about Sarah's welfare had triggered the investigation, continued to practice medicine in Millbrook until his death in 1871. His detailed notes about the case were donated to the Medical College of Virginia, where they contributed to early studies of trauma and psychological abuse. Harrison's observations about the long-term effects of sustained psychological manipulation influenced developing understanding of what would later be recognized as complex trauma disorders. The Reverend Whitmore, who had documented his unease about Margaret and Sarah's behavior in his private journals, left Millbrook in 1859 to serve a congregation in Richmond. His records of the case, preserved in church archives, provided some of the most detailed contemporary observations of the psychological dynamics that had enabled Margaret's crimes to continue undetected. Whitmore's notes emphasized the way normal social assumptions about women living alone had provided protective camouflage for criminal activity that might have attracted earlier attention if committed by male perpetrators. The farmland that had once comprised the Thornfield property was eventually restored to agricultural use. But local farmers noted persistent difficulties with crop yields in areas closest to where the house had stood. Whether these problems resulted from soil contamination related to the crimes committed there or simply reflected the psychological reluctance of workers to cultivate land associated with such disturbing history, the area remained less productive than surrounding fields for several decades. Mrs. Porter, whose reports of nocturnal digging had provided the first indication that unusual activities were occurring at the Thornfield property, lived until 1878. In her final years, she often spoke about the sounds she had heard during those autumn nights, describing them as different from any noise that normal farm work would produce. Her detailed recollections of the timing and character of these sounds provided investigators with crucial information about the periods when Margaret and Sarah had been most active in concealing evidence of their crimes. The legal precedents established by the Thornfield case influenced criminal prosecution throughout Virginia for the remainder of the 19th century. The careful documentation of systematic criminal behavior and the detailed testimony about psychological manipulation techniques provided templates that prosecutors used in similar cases involving domestic violence, systematic abuse, and crimes committed by individuals who had exploited social assumptions about their harmlessness to avoid detection. By 1900, the Thornfield case had become primarily a subject of academic study rather than living memory. Legal scholars and early criminologists referenced the case in studies of female perpetrators of violent crime and the social factors that enabled systematic criminal behavior to flourish in isolated rural communities. The detailed records preserved from the investigation provided researchers with unusually complete documentation of both the crimes themselves and the psychological techniques used to maintain the secrecy necessary for their continuation. The site where the Thornfield house had stood was eventually incorporated into a state highway project in 1923, and the road construction that followed effectively erased the last physical traces of the property, where 7 women had lost their lives. Local residents noted that the completion of the highway seemed to finally end the persistent reports of unexplained sounds and atmospheric disturbances that had continued to be associated with the area for decades after the crimes had been discovered and prosecuted. Sarah's story, after her release from prison in 1877, became the subject of occasional speculation but never definitive resolution. Some accounts suggested she had traveled west to territories where her past would not be known, while others indicated she had died within a few years of her release, unable to adapt to life outside the institutional environment that had provided structure during her decades of imprisonment. The lack of reliable information about her ultimate fate reflected both the deliberate obscurity she had sought and the limited record-keeping systems of the period. The Thornfield case remains documented in Virginia legal archives as one of the most systematically planned series of murders recorded in the state during the 19th century. The combination of careful premeditation, systematic victim selection, and sophisticated concealment techniques demonstrated a level of criminal organization that challenged contemporary understanding of violent crime and contributed to developing theories about the psychology of serial offenders. Modern analysis of the case has focused on the social and economic factors that enabled Margaret's transformation from a financially desperate widow to a systematic killer, and the psychological techniques she used to secure Sarah's participation in crimes that violated fundamental moral boundaries. The case continues to provide insights into the ways that extreme circumstances can interact with individual psychological vulnerabilities to produce criminal behavior that exceeds normal understanding of human capacity for violence. The basement chambers where the murders occurred were sealed with concrete and lime before the house was demolished, creating a permanent memorial to the victims, whose names and histories had been largely lost except for the fragmentary evidence recovered during the investigation. The decision to seal rather than simply fill the chambers reflected recognition that some sites of extreme violence require more complete isolation from future human contact than conventional disposal methods can provide. In the end, the Thornfield case serves as a reminder that the most disturbing crimes often develop in circumstances that appear mundane and unthreatening, protected by social assumptions that can provide effective camouflage for systematic criminal behavior. The isolation that enabled Margaret's crimes also ensured that their discovery came only after multiple victims had suffered and died in circumstances that their families and communities never fully understood. The documentation preserved from the case continues to provide researchers with insights into historical patterns of violent crime and the development of investigative techniques designed to identify systematic criminal behavior before it can claim additional victims. These insights remain relevant to contemporary understanding of how criminal activity can flourish in isolated circumstances, where normal social oversight mechanisms fail to function effectively. The legacy of Margaret Thornfield and the woman she refused to sell ultimately became a cautionary tale about the potential for evil to flourish when desperation, isolation, and opportunity converge in circumstances that allow systematic criminal behavior to develop without detection. The case demonstrated that the most effective camouflage for extreme crimes is often the appearance of normalcy maintained by those whose very ordinariness makes them invisible to the social scrutiny that might otherwise prevent such tragedies from occurring.